In this video we want to discuss the Harvard Framework in the context of HRM, of course. Now this is a very important class. It's one that's quite famous in the sense that everyone who's serious about the study of HRM will have encountered this class somewhere in their studies. So it's important for us to cover it and to treat it seriously, and it's advisable that you make your own notes and pad out your notes, do some supplementary reading, and make sure you've got a good understanding of the content of the class. You'll see from the bottom right hand corner of the slide in front of you that we have 97 slides, so it's quite a significant amount of work. So it's advisable to stop the video from time to time and have a break and return to it later. So let's talk about the Harvard Framework. The Harvard Framework is a model designed by the Harvard Business School and is the most influential model of HRM. A very important model, one that should be understood, as I said, one put forward by the Harvard Business School. The model is associated as a soft HRM model. It's recognized as a soft HRM model, as its primary focus is based on outcomes for people, their well-being and organizational commitment. So these are termed as soft models when essentially when we consider the focus on people and their well-being and organizational commitment. These are not topics that we can subject to very hard analytical scrutiny. These are ones that are have many factors that contribute to the outcome. People are not predictable, not 100% predictable at least, and organizational commitment and motivation within work and the application of effort within work can vary widely from organization to organization and under different circumstances. So for all of these reasons, we consider these type of models to be soft models. They don't give us precise predictive outcomes. The model views employees as stakeholders in the business who have their own interests. They will only commit to an organization if they want to. So people who work for organizations do so because it's in their interest to work for the organization. They want a salary. They want to be able to survive and pay their own bills. They have their own agenda, in other words. And this means that organizations must accommodate their employees in terms of their requirements and their expectations. Unlike the Michigan model, which focuses on business strategies, the Harvard model focuses on gaining employee commitment and cooperation. The focus of the Harvard model is to try to see what it is that motivates workers. What is it that gains their loyalty and their cooperation? And it tries to develop ideas associated with further developing cooperation and commitment and application within the working realm. And employees are encouraged through incentive schemes and through all sorts of motivational methods to focus on their tasks, to give good effort and to enable the organization to grow and to flourish. The Harvard model acknowledges mutuality in all businesses and focuses on managers' methods of managing employees. There is a mutuality in the sense that it's in the employee's interest that the business does well. And clearly it's in the business's interest that the business does well. So both sides have an interest to see the business doing well. There is a mutuality, in other words. The managers for their part, they are looking for methods that will enable them to use the employees effectively within the business, but at the same time generating motivational techniques and generating methods of working and ways of deploying the personnel in a way that suits the people, suits their aptitudes, their abilities, recognizes their contribution, applauds good work. So the idea of motivation permeates the whole organization. It runs from top to bottom. The model aims to delegate more responsibility to general managers to perform HR tasks, getting general managers involved in HR. In other words, the realm of HR is not confined to a HR department. The realm of HR is the business, and that all managers within the business should recognize the importance of human resources and should make efforts to engage with the workforce to try to foster good practice and generate productivity gains and try to motivate the workforce and congratulate them on a job well done and just generally create an environment which is cooperative. So the responsibility for HR, the HR department, is probably along the lines of deciding on training programs or on recruitment or on people exiting from the business and health and safety issues and putting those sort of programs into place. But the motivational factors, the issues that are associated with productivity and with day-to-day running of the business, these permeate the whole business. They run through all the various lines of management. The Harvard Framework follows a process where all stages influence each other. The organization is seen as one organization. There are not distinct parts with different characteristics. The employees in one department need to be motivated in the same way as the employees in a different department. Both have a need for motivation. Both have a need for respect and for acknowledgement when they do a good job, and they need to be trained and they need to be recognized. So it's a human attribute. So the framework, the HR framework, cuts across all of the organization. The model distinguishes the link between internal and external factors on HRM. There are significant internal factors that can be identified, and we'll talk about these later. But clearly, remuneration, working conditions, greater understanding of the requirements of the workforce. These are all internal factors, but there are external factors as well. The forces of the market, for example, the perception of the product in the mind of the customer who may buy it or not buy it, the quality aspects of production, also the general effect of the environment, the economic environment, the social environment, and so on the business. And these need to be taken into account. Both the internal and external factors play an important role on developing HR policies and practices. Clearly, the business exists within society, and therefore whatever's happening in society will somehow affect the business. The business is not operating in a vacuum. It's operating in society. So whatever the trends in society are, the chances are these will be reflected in working practices within the business. Likewise, of course, the economy. which affects unemployment, inflation, imports, exports, globalization. These sort of considerations are important for the business also. So whatever happens in one part affects the business. It happens in the other part. The business is not in a cocoon, immune to everything that's around it. The external factors outlined by the model include stakeholder interest and situational factors. The stakeholder interest, well, stakeholders are simply any people who have an interest in the business. The suppliers of raw materials have an interest in the business because that's who they sell to. The suppliers of machinery have an interest in the business, but so also have the trade unions, so also has the government. The local community where the business is located, they've got an interest in the business. The employees certainly have an interest in the business. They work for the business directly and depend on it for their incomes. So there are various stakeholders we can identify, usually a large number, that are affected by businesses. The situational factors, well, these are the situations that the business finds itself in terms of its position in the market, in terms of its technological base, in terms of its customer base, its perceptions, and so on. We'll talk about these in much more detail in the coming slides, but just for the moment, the external factors outlined by the model include stakeholder interest and situational factors. As I said, we'll come to those shortly. In fact, very shortly. In fact, now. The situational factors, I'm just going to put this rectangle on here. I'm going to fill out the rectangle as we go through, but it's going to appear on this slide and now it's going to vanish in a moment and it'll come back later, so don't get too worried about it coming and going. But I'm going to fill in the various situational factors in this rectangle. But for the moment, let's see what we mean by them. So, situational factors. Well, this is the context in which the business operates. It's the situation in which it finds itself. The external environment influences the way in which HR policies and practices are developed. So there is an external environment, and the HR department must develop policies and practices broadly in line with whatever the external environment indicates as appropriate. The business, for example, operates in an environment where there are legal obligations. Clearly the HR department must ensure that the business follows the legal obligations as set out by the law of the country, the law of the land. That's just one illustration. The company operates in an economy where there are big economic forces in play. Globalization, the rate of interest changes, money supply, inflation, unemployment. There are many big influences coming from outside of the organization. It's the situation in which the business finds itself. It's a situational factor. So situational factors include workforce characteristics, the labour markets, union representatives, culture, laws, societal values, management philosophy, business strategy, and technology requirements. I'm sure the list can be added to. There may be other influences as well, but you can see it's very broad. But that's what faces the business. The business, as I said earlier, does not operate in a vacuum. It's not cocooned from the world. It's not locked away from the world. It operates in the world. And these are the forces that are in play in the world. And they will impact on the business. Now the internal factors. Well, there are workforce characteristics. There's business strategy and conditions. What does the business, where does it see itself? What does it want to do? What does it want to focus on? Which markets does it want to operate in? Management philosophy, looking at the way management structures the business, the way the business is designed, the attitude of management towards the workforce, the sympathetic views that management may have towards working conditions, the way they apply health and safety regulations, training within the organisation. So the management will have a particular philosophy or a view of how to operate. The labour market, of course, will influence the workforce as well. If the labour market is buoyant and wages are rising in the economy in general, then it may be difficult to retain workers within the business. They'll want to move to higher paid occupations. So the labour market will have an influence. The unions, of course, will have an influence because they are the ones that will negotiate with the management over pay, general remuneration, conditions of employment, health and safety, holiday entitlement. So the unions must be taken into account as well. Task technology, the tasks that the technology perform. The business may employ specialist machinery, perhaps robotic machinery, or may have computer-aided manufacturing or computer-aided design requirements. And there may be changes in the technology, or there may be upgrades, and they may have the need for more training, or technology impacts on the business. It's important that the business is aware of what's happening in terms of the technology and is close to the front, because that's where productivity gains can be achieved. And of course there are laws and societal values. The attitude of management towards its workforce in terms of discrimination, or managing diversity, or employment of women, or of disabled people, or what sort of provisions do they make for the employment of these people? Do they accommodate their requirements and their needs? What are the values of the society in which the business is located? And of course the stakeholder interest that I mentioned earlier. Now the stakeholder interest, well, these include all stakeholders who have an interest in the business. Stakeholders have a financial interest and want assurance that the business will grow. Now those are, shareholders. So those are an important stakeholder. They're the owners of the business. Management want to ensure organizational goals are met and employees are interested in job security. So the management will try to ensure the survival of the business, but also ensure their own survival. They'll want high salaries, good working conditions. They'll want to be associated with a successful business. But they'll also want to see their employees having job security, and because that will enable them to have more continuity at work. It's easier to work with the existing workforce than to have to train new employees, perhaps to train them on a regular basis. The government are interested in employee protection and growth. So the government is a stakeholder. But as I said earlier, there are many other stakeholders we could list. There are many people who have a financial interest in the business. The suppliers of raw materials, or specialist machinery, or the local community. There are many different types of stakeholders. So we've only listed out a few here, but there are others. Now if we go back to our diagram, now we can see we filled out the situational factors. Not exhaustively, but a lot. And now we're working on the stakeholder interest, and we know who the stakeholders are, or at least some of the significant stakeholders. There are others, as I said. The external environment is the context in which the organization operates. Businesses exist in society. They exist in the economy. As I keep saying, or I've said a couple of times before, they don't operate in a vacuum. They're not isolated from the rest of the economy or of the rest of society. They operate within it, and therefore they must factor in the changes that are coming about in the economy, the changes that are coming about in society, because that's what they're working with. These factors are directly linked with internal factors such as HRM policy, which in turn leads to HR outcomes. So when there are pressures on the organization, pressures for change perhaps, for opening up new ways of working because of changes in society, perhaps more flexible working to accommodate family life. Perhaps there are movements in society requesting this. When the organization does it, tries to implement this policy, this is a HR policy. And it has to come to HR outcomes. It has to manifest itself in flexible working conditions. But the policy has to be brought through the organization, agreed by senior management, and the organization needs to be retooled or restructured to accommodate that. So here's a situation where society has led to big changes within the organization. The HR outcomes have long-term consequences which have a feedback response on stakeholders' interest and situational factors. So if we continue the example of flexible working, as I just introduced it earlier, this will have an impact on stakeholders. Stakeholders may not get the same returns because the organization has to accommodate more flexible working and will not get as high a return on its assets perhaps as before. So the introduction of policies which are really driven by external forces may lead to a diminution in returns. So therefore stakeholders may be adversely affected. So now we've seen that stakeholders, who they are and how the stakeholders can be affected by changes in the situation in which the business finds itself, the situational factors. Management is a type of stakeholder, as are employee groups. The government, of course, is a stakeholder. The company pays tax to the government. It creates employment. It creates economic well-being within that particular region or that particular area. People find jobs there. So we have the broader stakeholders. We have the management are clearly stakeholders. They want to have security of employment. They want to have good jobs and well paid. Employee groups, the trade unions, have an interest, and the government has an interest. So also, as I said earlier, has the community, because the company creates employment, it creates training, it gives people work experience, and some people work there and support their families and their lives through involvement with the business. The unions are stakeholders. The unions want their members to be treated well, but they do want membership and they want to be involved in the business. They want to be able to negotiate with the management. They want to engage in collective bargaining and try to find good outcomes which will not just sustain the business but will give the workforce better working conditions and perhaps better remuneration. So these two sets, the situational factors which influence the stakeholders, this leads to HR policy. Now, if we can just think about HR policy here for a second, um, the policy could be represented by something like this. We have the work systems, we have the human resource flow, people coming into the organization and leaving the organization. We have the rewards. So we have the corner points, or the apex, or whatever you want to call it here, of this triangle. And in the center we have the employee influence. So the employees influence the flow of human resources. If the employees are happy, they'll stay within the organization. If they're not so happy, they will have an incentive to move. The work systems will also be influenced by the employees, what the employees can do, their skill sets, their willingness to participate with the organization, their willingness to engage in change and engage in technological innovations and upgrades of technology used within the workforce. And of course, the rewards will be a key determinant of whether the employees are going to continue or perhaps look for other occupations. So the HR policy area is associated with this. It's trying to deal with these almost conflicting issues. Having good human resource flow means a contented workforce, means few people leaving. But few people may not want to leave, I should say, simply because the working practices are settled. In other words, the working practices could become out of date. And upgrading the working practices with new technology and new ways of working may lead to employees wishing to leave. So there are tensions within the organization. The Harvard Framework proposes 4 HR policy areas. HR personnel and labour relation activities are dealt with under policy areas. So personnel and labour relations, these are dealt with under the policy areas. These are dealt with in situations where the organisation has set out its policies regarding labour, regarding remuneration, regarding training, regarding the requirements for work within the organisation. So the HR policy determines the approach that the management will take towards its dealings with its workforce. The policies must be designed in line with the organisation, the employee and the stakeholder interest. So policies that the HR department follow must they must satisfy the requirements of the organisation, the broad requirements of the organisation in terms of its productivity, its functioning, but also the employees. They must be content, and as indeed should the stakeholders. HRM will be ineffective if policies are disjointed, follow from old practices, or ad hoc responses to external pressures. The HR department has an obligation to develop coherent policies, ones which flow from one period to the next and which do not represent radical departures in policy, because that will upset the workforce. It will upset the stakeholders indeed, because the stakeholders will see the workforce alienated from the organisation. So the policies that HR follow should represent a continuum. It should be ones which are based on the past, but modified and updated according to current practice, current understanding, and modernized, because the business itself will be renewing itself in accordance with the technological requirements for modern businesses, and also more enlightened ways of dealing with the workforce. So ad hoc responses, or just made up responses to external forces, could represent a situation where the business seems to be out of control. There's no confidence in the business, which will alienate the workforce. So, employee influence. Well, this is the central feature of HR systems. Employees are important stakeholders, and management must have systems in place to promote employee influence. Organizations have changed since the Industrial Revolution. At the time of the Industrial Revolution, management was all powerful, and the employees were merely operators. They were functionaries. The employees simply served a function within the business. Their opinions were not sought. But over a period of time, they have been recognized as a valuable source of information, of criticism, constructive criticism. They make a valuable contribution to the life of the business. They are not just facilitators of production. They are people. They have opinions and attitudes. They may have strong ideas about the quality of the product, or the price of the product, or the placement, the distribution channel for the product, the image of the product. They may also be consumers. So they may work but also be consumers, and therefore have an opinion about the product. And it's good for the marketing section, for example, to be able to consult with the workers and ask their opinions about the product or about some proposal. The introduction of quality procedures depends critically on the contribution of the workers and the extent to which they buy into the policy. So the employees are important stakeholders, and management must have systems in place to promote employee influence. The employees have a lot to lose if the business doesn't do well. They lose job security. They might lose bonuses or annual increments in pay. So the management must recognize that the employees are genuinely interested, and therefore they can seek their advice and their opinions. And the employees should have an influence in the direction in which the business is travelling. To what extent do managers delegate power, authority, responsibility and decision making to employees? That's the question. It's trust. It's based on trust. To what extent does the management trust the employees to make good decisions? To what extent should the management delegate power to the employees, delegate authority and responsibility? Do they trust the employees to be able to do this? Or to perhaps the employees will not commit themselves, and therefore the business could be damaged because it loses time, it loses momentum, because the employees are not focused on the tasks which were delegated. But if the employees recognize the importance of the business to them and to their families, and in terms of the job security and their ability to survive in life, then presumably the employees will make a good contribution and will relish the fact that they have been rewarded by having more power and more authority and more freedom to act, more responsibility and more involvement with the business. Any influence exerted on employees should be compatible with management objectives and priorities. There is no need to exert pressure on employees if it is not aimed at supporting the corporate objectives of the business or of achieving some objective which is felt desirable. The objectives of the business should be clearly set out. The priorities of the business should be set out. And getting employees to focus in on those and trying to influence their thinking, that should be compatible with the achievement of the objectives and priorities of the business. Otherwise, there's a mismatch. The employees are thinking about something else and the business is thinking about something else, and the two are moving in different directions. So clearly there should be a focus. Both should be focused in on the achievement of the same objectives and achieving the same priorities, achieving the same outcomes. So the human resource flow, well, the flow of employees meets the business requirements. First of all, the right employees should be engaged with the right skills and at the right time. And that's a function of the HR recruitment policy. It's a question of finding the right employees with the right skills at the right time. It's not an easy task. It depends on the complexity of the business. It depends on the location of the business. It depends on the remuneration being offered. So it depends on many factors. But essentially, the right employees should be found, and that is the pressure that's on the HR department to recruit the right people. The policy is concerned with the flow of employees into, through, and out of the organisation. Managing the human resource flow is part of the HR remit. That's what they're there for. It's to get proper employees, good employees with suitable skills into the business. Look after the employees in the business to ensure continuity of employment and continuity of the business, and then see the employees out at the end and see them out on good terms with good memories and good experiences. So it involves decision making on recruitment, selection, promotion, cessation of employment, job security, career development and fair treatment. And that's a good list of some of the issues that the HR policy should address and should bear in mind when managing the human resource flow. The reward systems, well, employees should have an influence over the types of rewards they receive for their progress. So the employees should be able to influence the types of rewards. They should be able to speak to management and talk to management over the rewards and look at the differences in rewards between occupations and at different levels throughout the business to ensure there's some sort of fairness and some sort of recognition of how the reward systems are allocated. Extrinsic rewards are tangible, involving pay and benefits. They have performance-related pay, overtime, bonuses, pension, profit sharing, health insurance, and so on. So these are extrinsic rewards. These are tangible in the sense that they can be identified against areas like overtime working or working to meet particular targets, and bonuses are paid and so on. Intrinsic rewards are intangible. For example, motivation, job satisfaction, achievement, self-confidence and esteem, commitment. So intrinsic rewards may not have a monetary aspect, at least an explicit, overt monetary aspect. They may be related to recognition that a job was well done, congratulations, worker of the month, or it could be some sort of extra responsibility, perhaps at the same level, but extra responsibility and more recognition of a job well done. It doesn't have to be more pay. It could be recognition and certain fringe benefits, perhaps, within the organisation. Work systems. I said there were 4 HR policies on an earlier slide, and you see now we've worked our way through to the final one on the HR policy, the work systems. This refers to work structure to ensure that it is efficient, productive, and meets organisational objectives. So the HR policy should try to ensure that the work structure is efficient. It should be explained to the employees why the structure is the way it is, why it's felt that that is the efficient structure. They should be trained in the use of any equipment or machines or in any processes that needs to be understood to enable the work system to continue and to be productive, and which will enable it to meet the organisational objectives. So the onus is on proper training and orientation of the workforce towards meeting the organisational objectives. Work systems must encourage communications channels, and appropriate technology is in place to allow employees to do their job. So good work systems should have good communications channels. The employees should be able to talk to line managers, and line managers talk to departmental managers, and so on. Depends on the structure of the business, but there should be good communications channels. Issues should be brought up and dealt with straight away. It shouldn't be allowed to fester and go bad and cause bad feelings or cause discontent in the future. It could be good ideas come through, and the communication system will feed back good ideas about how to improve the work situation. Appropriate technology should be in place, not just to facilitate the communications channels, but also in terms of enabling the employees to do a good job. The proper tools should be made available and in sufficient supply and of sufficient quality. Plus, there should be adequate training in all of these to ensure that the employees are able to use them effectively. Information, activities and technology are arranged at all levels of the organisation. So the flow of information within the organisation should be efficient. Information should be disseminated widely so that the employees throughout the organisation know what's happening, what the policy is, the direction that the business is running in, what it's planning. There should be no surprises to the employees. Employees do not like surprises. They don't like turning up for work to find that something has changed radically over the weekend. They like continuity. And they can cope with change if adequately informed. Plus, it indicates trust in the employees. The management are taking the employees into their trust and explaining what they're doing. And it's for the HR section to enable this to happen, to disseminate the information, to pass it out, to ensure that the context in which the information is delivered is properly understood, but also that the message itself is presented in a manner which is acceptable, that the language is acceptable, that the technicalities are explained, and the rationale for the changes, if there are changes proposed, are clearly articulated. So we've looked at the 4 HR policies that we mentioned earlier. Now the HR outcomes. Well, this section follows on from HR policy and is concerned with the 4 C's: commitment, congruence, competence, and cost effectiveness. Management must consider the extent to which HR policies enable the organisation to achieve the 4 C's. So HR policies should enable the organisation to achieve these 4 C's. Now, start with commitment, then competence, congruence, and cost effectiveness. Commitment. To what extent should HR policies gain employee commitment to the organisation? Well, it's a leading question to some extent, because clearly the HR policies should gain commitment. Clearly the workforce should be committed towards achieving the objectives of the business. The business and the employees should be pulling in the same direction. If they're pulling in the opposite directions, then the business is doomed. But getting the commitment from the employees is a function of HRM. This is an outcome from the stages we talked about earlier. And it's important that the effectiveness of the HR policy is judged in terms of the amount of commitment that the employees give to the employers. So commitment is important. Congruence. Are the employees compatible to management styles and fit in with other employees? It's important, again, as an outcome. Have the right people been recruited? Have they got a commitment to the management? Do they understand the management? Do they understand and relate to management objectives? Do they simply just agree with management, or are there conflict between them? Is the conflict inevitable? Is it personality? What is it? What's the problem? Is there congruence between one set of employees and another? Perhaps the employees can't work together. They find it difficult to relate to each other. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. Competence. The organization's capability to attract, retain, and develop employees to desired levels of competency. It's the competency of the employees which generates their productivity, which in turn cuts costs and increases profitability. So it's important that the employees have competencies. And these competencies can be trained, but they'll also develop out of learning by doing over a long period of time. And for this reason alone, it's important that the HR department recognise that it's important to retain those workers. If the workers leave, then that competency will leave as well. And they'll have to be replaced by new employees who will have to be retrained and trained and developed and will make mistakes and so on until they have achieved competency as well. So a HR outcome should be to have competent workers, and having competent workers is a reflection of good HR policy. Cost effectiveness. How can management maintain costs whilst enhancing employee job satisfaction? So having policies which generate interest amongst the employees and gains their confidence and motivates them and gets them more involved. A lot of these exercises can be costly. It may take time, may take training programs, and there might be training on new skill acquisition and updating skills and so on. It's expensive. So how can the business manage its costs at the same time as engaging in these activities, improving employees' skills and improving the way employees see the job and see the organization, improving their job satisfaction? So it's for the HR department to try and find solutions which will enable them to develop the employees and create better job satisfaction, but at the same time controlling costs. So out of the HR policy, which was born from situational factors and the stakeholders' interest, we've got the HR outcomes. Now the HR outcomes are going to lead into long-term consequences. This section follows on from HR policy and outcomes. It's concerned with individual well-being. It's the long-term consequences of everything we've talked about, really. It's the individual's well-being, how the individual sees the organization, how the individual feels about working there, how the individual feels about their self-worth, how they feel about the way they spend their working lives. The organization must consider if HR policy and outcomes meet the needs of employees and their well-being. Employees are people. They're spending their lives, a big proportion of their life, perhaps working for the organization. That is their life. And their well-being is important. Their physical well-being and their mental well-being is important. And the policies that were designed by HR and the outcomes from those policies should promote the well-being of the workers, which will give them greater job satisfaction. They should find going to work not stressful and onerous. They should feel that it's a supportive organisation, and they in turn should do their best to not just promote the ideals of the organisation, but to do so efficiently and competently. Is the organisation able to effectively compete within the external market? The outcomes from HR policy should not just be developing people and developing a sense of well-being, as we talked about earlier, or developing good communications channels within the organisation, more involvement and so on. But it should also enable the business to compete effectively. It should lead to increases in productivity, reductions in cost. It should enable the organisation to have better quality, better health and safety records as well for the employees, better distribution, more knowledge of the markets. There should be a keenness amongst the workforce to make the business work and work effectively and become perhaps even market leader. So the organisation should be capable of competing externally in the marketplace. And it's able to do that because it has a willing workforce behind it. Do the policies, I should say, and outcomes benefit the society and the community? If the company is going to stay in existence, then does the society benefit? Does the community benefit? Does it create more employment? Does it put back something? It's existing within the community. There's an outside community. The business shared the roads with those people, and it may make noise and pollute the atmosphere to some extent. Does it do that? Or does it benefit the society? Does it put something back? Does it support a sports club, or does it create employment which help local producers of other products to sell their products because there's more income in the area? So to what extent do the policies of the business promote the interest of the community? What are the connections? Can these be identified? Organizational objectives and societal well-being. You can see there are feedbacks from this, of course. The long-term consequence going back towards the stakeholders, the community. Does the community benefit from all of what we said? If it doesn't, then it'll feed back to the stakeholder interest, which may lead to the development of a pressure group or some sort of local activist group who will oppose the business and get the business a bad name and a bad reputation, or perhaps it'll feed back to the stakeholder group something positive, and the community will support the business. But you can see there are feedbacks. The long-term consequences go back. It feeds back to the situational factors. It feeds back to the stakeholders. And these have to come again, perhaps be modified, come again through new HR policies, which will generate new HR outcomes, which will generate new long-term consequences. So there is a cycle. The model is a soft approach to HRM and identifies employees as important stakeholders. This is our summary. So that's what the Harvard model is about. The assumption is that stakeholder interests are most likely to be met if HR policy and outcomes positively respond to long-term consequences. So stakeholder interests are most likely to be met if HR policy and outcomes positively respond to long-term consequences. So HR policy should be fixed on the long-term consequences. What are the long-term consequences of the policy? It's clearly not the case, as I said earlier, that HR policy should vary on a regular basis, because it will lead to uncertainty and insecurity. The model also emphasizes on employee influence and decision making as key to success. So employee influence is very important. Working with the workforce, the management working with the workforce, is seen as the optimal solution. Employees give their opinions, give their recommendations, they cooperate with the management. And taking their decisions into account is important. That's one of the keys to success. And I'll just see from the bottom right hand corner of the slide, we're on slide 96, so we're just about finished. This is a long class. It's well worth revisiting the class perhaps several times, making your own notes and understanding what's involved in the Harvard Framework. This is a very important class. It's one that all professionals within the HR sector will have encountered and will have studied. It's one that is essential that everyone in HR should know and understand. But that's all we're going to do in this session, so we're going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.